Chapter 1. From the USA into the CSA. The year 1861 found me a second lieutenant of Engineers, USA, on duty with Co-A engineer troops at Fort Steilacoom, Washington Territory. I had entered West Point from Georgia in 1853 and graduated in 1857. For 3 years after my graduation, I served, generally at the military academy, as an assistant instructor, but on 2 occasions was absent for 6 months at a time upon special details. On the first, with Captains James C. Duane and 64 men of the Engineer Company, we were sent out to Utah for duty with General Albert Sidney Johnston in what was then called the Mormon War. In 1857, the Mormons had refused to receive a governor of the territory, appointed by President Buchanan, and assumed a hostile attitude. Johnston was sent with about 2,000 men to install the new governor, Alfred Cumming of Georgia. The Mormons took arms, fortified the passes of the Wasatch Mountains, and captured and burned trains of supplies for the troops. The near approach of winter decided the War Department to halt Johnston and put him in winter quarters at Fort Bridger, east of the Wasatch, until he could be heavily reinforced in the spring. 6 columns of reinforcements were ordered from Fort Leavenworth, and of these, our detachment and the 6th Infantry composed column No. 1, and marched on May 6, 1858. The only travelled route at that time passed by Fort Kearny, Fort Laramie, and the Great South Pass. Our column was ordered to open a new route, following the South Platte to Lodge Pole Creek, and up that stream to its headwaters in the southern Black Hills, and thence, via Bridger's Pass, to join the old road a short distance east of Fort Bridger. Only Fremont, some years before, had ever gone through by that route, and it was thought to be materially shorter. When we got into the mountains, we found it necessary to leave the 6th Infantry in camp and to go ahead with our company to make a practicable road. We also had to ferry, using iron wagon bodies as boats, the Laramie, the North Platte, and Green Rivers. Fort Bridger was reached on Aug. 86 days, 970 miles. The new route proved to be 49 miles shorter than the South Pass Road. Without mails for 6 weeks, it was only on arrival at Fort Bridger we learned that the Mormon War was over. Brigham Young, on seeing the large force prepared to install his rival, Governor Cumming, had wisely concluded to submit and forego his dream of independence. Perhaps he was the wisest leader of a people seeking freedom, of all his generation. At first, the Mormons deserted their homes and proposed to burn them and migrate to Mexico. Neither Confederate nor Boer was more devoted to his cause than the Mormons to their own. But Brigham Young knew when the time to surrender had come, and he deserves a monument for knowing it and acting upon the knowledge, even though by doing so he greatly disappointed many young officers, myself among them, anxious to see active service. Meanwhile, an important Indian war had broken out in Oregon, and the detachment of our company which had been left at West Point was now on its way there via the Isthmus under Lutz Cassey and Robert. Orders had, therefore, been issued recalling our detachment to West Point and directing the 6th Infantry to march on by land to Oregon. On Ogden 9, we set out via the South Pass and Fort Laramie route and reached Leavenworth, 10-19 miles, on Octon 356 days. We laid over 8 Sundays and 1 day at Laramie, and made 47 marches averaging 22 miles each. The longest march was 27 miles. These figures are of interest for comparison with marches made on special occasions in the war. The conditions of the march were the most favourable possible, being over good roads, in good weather, by a small body, with all ammunition and knapsacks carried in a train of nearly empty wagons, and officers and men all anxious to make a quick trip. Distances were carefully measured by an odometer. Rests during the march were about 10 minutes in each hour, and the average rate of movement on good ground was a mile in 20 minutes. From Leavenworth we took a boat to St. Louis, and thence rail to New York and West Point, arriving Oct. 13. The plains at this period were in their pristine wildness, and I had enjoyed the march greatly. Buffalo and antelope were abundant, and I was fond of hunting. The Indians were armed but with bows and arrows, and dressed only in breechclouts, blankets, feathers, and paint. Gold was first discovered on Cherry Creek, near what is now Denver, during this summer, and on our return we met the earliest emigrants going out to that section. Within 2 years there was a considerable city there, with theatres and daily papers. I remained at West Point a year as assistant instructor in engineering, and during the summer of 1859 was put in charge of the Department of Fencing and Target Practice. In Octi, 1859, I was assigned to special duty with Assistant Surgeon A.J. Meyer to experiment with a system of military signals which he had devised and offered to the War Department. It was based upon the use of Bain's telegraphic alphabet, which formed the letters by the use of only 2 elements, dot and dash. The Morse alphabet uses 4, dot, short dash, long dash, and interval between dashes. Meyer had originally suggested its use as a language for the deaf and dumb when he was a medical student. By the waving of anything to the left for dot and to the right for dash, any letter could be indicated by a few waves. For 3 months we experimented with flags, torches, and glasses between Fort Hamilton and Sandy Hook, and, in Jan, 1860, we reported to the War Department in Washington with what has been since known as the wig-wag signal system. A bill was introduced into Congress to adopt the system, and Meyer and I were directed to exhibit it to the military committees. I was also assigned to temporary duty on a board of officers experimenting with breech-loading rifles, of which there were several models being offered to the War Department. By April 1860, the signal bill having been favourably reported, I was relieved from special duty and ordered back to West Point, but was given a leave of absence for 60 days. During this leave I married Miss Betty Mason of King George Commonsvar. Soon after returning to West Point, I was ordered to relieve Lieutenant Robert at Fort Steilacoom in Washington Territory with the detachment of our company. With my wife, I sailed on the steamer Northern Light for Aspinwall on August 10, by the John L. Stevens from Panama on the 19th, and by the Cortez from San Francisco on September 8, landing at Steilacoom City on September 20. All steamers of those days were side-wheelers. The post was commanded by Coller Silas Casey of the 9th Infantry, and garrisoned by 2 companies of the 9th Infantry and our detachment of 36 engineer troops under Lieutenant Thomas L. Casey. There were no duties but those of company routine. The post was a very pleasant one. The woods and waters abounded in game and fish. The climate was mild and open, and the fall and winter passed rapidly. But it was a period of great anxiety to Southern officers whose native states, after debating the question of secession, began one after another to take the step. There was generally little active interest taken by army officers in political questions, but, with few exceptions, the creed was held that, as a matter of course, in case war should result from secession, each officer would go with his state. In February we received news of the secession of Georgia. There seemed then, however, strong probability of a peaceful separation. In March came orders for the return of our detachment to West Point. No vessel was then running to any port in Puget Sound, and we had to wait until special arrangements for our transportation could be made. Our quartermaster department, however, maintained an armed vessel, the Massachusetts, upon the Sound to keep off invasions of the Stikane Indians, who made raids from Alaska in their immense war canoes. This vessel was directed to take us to Port Townsend, and there the Cortez, which ran between San Francisco and Vancouver's Island, would call and get us. We sailed from Steilacoom City in the afternoon of April 9, 1861. 4 years later, to an hour, I saw General Lee ride back to his lines from Appomattox Courthouse, where he had just surrendered his army. On April 12th we took the Cortes, and after touching at Squimalt and Portland, we reached San Francisco on the 20th. We were too late to catch the Panama steamer of that date, as we had hoped, and the next boat was May 1st. As our steamer made fast to the wharf, all my personal plans were upset. A special messenger, waiting on the wharf, came aboard and handed me an order by telegraph and pony express, relieving me from duty with my company, and ordering me to report to Lieutenant Macpherson in charge of Alcatraz Island, San Francisco Harbor. I was very sorry to receive this order, as it deprived me of transportation, leaving me, with my wife, over 6,000 miles from home by the only available route, and it precipitated my own resignation, which I might have reasonably delayed until I was back in the East. But there was now no longer any doubt that war was inevitable, and indeed, within a day or two, the Pony Express and Telegraph Line brought news of the fall of Fort Sumter. So when I reported to Macpherson in obedience to my orders, I told him that I must resign and go with my state, and I begged that he would forward my resignation, and at the same time give me a leave of absence, which would allow me to go home and await the acceptance of my resignation there. He had authority to give such leave, and unless he gave it, I would be compelled to remain in San Francisco, which would detain me at least 2 months. While Macpherson proved himself afterward to be a great soldier, he was also one of the most attractive and universally beloved and admired men whom I have ever met. His reply to my request was like a prophecy in its foresight, and its affectionate kindness appealed to me very deeply. I have always remembered the conversation vividly. He said, "If you must go, I will give the leave of absence and do all in my power to facilitate your going. But don't go. These urgent orders to stop you here are meant to say that if you are willing to keep out of the war on either side, you can do so. They mean that you will not be asked to go into the field against your own people, but that you will be kept on this coast upon fortification duty as long as the war lasts. General Totten likes you and wants to keep you in the corps. That is what these orders mean. This war is not going to be the 90 days affair that papers and politicians are predicting. Both sides are in deadly earnest, and it is going to be fought out to the bitter end. If you go as an educated soldier, you will be put in the front rank. God only knows what may happen to you individually, but for your cause there can be but one result. It must be lost. Your whole population is only about 8 millions, while the North has 20 millions. Of your 8 millions, 3 millions are slaves who may become an element of danger. You have no army, no navy, no treasury, and practically none of the manufactures and machine shops necessary for the support of armies and for war on a large scale. You are but scattered agricultural communities, and you will be cut off from the rest of the world by blockade. Your cause must end in defeat, and the individual risks to you must be great. On the other hand, if you stay out here, you will soon be the ranking engineer officer on this whole coast. Every one of the older officers will soon be called east for active service, and there will be casualties and promotion, and probably increase of the corps. Meanwhile, you will have every chance to make a reputation for yourself as an engineer, and you will have charge of this big Lime Point reservation, about 10,000 acres, all covered with wild oats. Buy a flock of sheep and put on it, hire a Mexican to herd them, and in 4 years you will be a rich man. The city of San Francisco, too, is filling in water lots, and the engineer officers are consulted in fixing the harbour lines. This will give you information and opportunities in making good investments. Briefly, remaining here, you have every opportunity for professional reputation, for promotion, and for wealth. Going home, you have every personal risk to run, and in a cause foredoomed to failure. I could not but be greatly impressed by this appeal. It made me realize, as I had never done before, the gravity of the decision which I had to make. But one consideration was inexorable. I must go with my people. So I answered, "What you say is probably all true, but my situation is just this. My people are going to war. They are in deadly earnest, believing it to be for their liberty. If I don't come and bear my part, they will believe me to be a coward, and I shall not know whether I am or not. I have just got to go and stand my chances." His reply was, "In your situation, I would probably feel the same way about it." So I wrote my resignation, dating it May 1st, and Macpherson gave me leave of absence, and did everything possible to make my going easy and comfortable. I never saw him again after our sad parting on the dock, for, as he had foreseen, he was ordered east, and, having been made a Major General and won high distinction, was killed at Atlanta in July 1864. My resignation was duly accepted, and notice reached me in August, before the mails to the south through Kentucky were entirely discontinued. We sailed on May 1st in the Golden Age, crossed the Isthmus on the 14th, and arrived in New York on steamer Champion on the 24th, having lost 2 days in a severe gale. We landed early, and had intended remaining in New York for a day or two, but while we had been upon our journey, events had been in progress. President Lincoln had called for 75,000 troops. All of the border states had refused to furnish troops and had taken part with those which had seceded, and a small federal army had been collected at Washington. On the night before our arrival, a part of this force was marched across into Virginia and occupied Alexandria. Cole Ellsworth, commanding the leading regiment, had entered a hotel and torn down a secession flag from its roof. The proprietor, Jackson, had shot Ellsworth dead as he came downstairs and had been killed himself. My wife and I were shopping in Canal Street about noon, when a man rushed into the store and shouted out this news. The excitement which this caused, and the hostility to all Confederates evident in general conversation, warned me that if I were known to be a resigned officer on my way to enter the Confederate Army, I might encounter trouble. We cut short our shopping and decided to leave for Louisville by the first train. Kentucky was endeavoring to take a position of neutrality in the conflict, and through that state we could make our way to Georgia. We left at 5 p.m. on 26th by the Erie Road, and going through Cleveland, Cincinnati, Seymour, and Jefferson, we reached Louisville on the 27th and Chattanooga on May 28th. Here I met the Confederate Secretary of War, Hondale P. Walker, on his way to Richmond, Virginia, now the capital of the Confederacy. I called on him and was told that a commission as Captain of Engineers was awaiting my acceptance. Of course I accepted, and promised to report in Richmond as soon as I could leave my wife in Washington Gay, at my father's home. We spent that night in Atlanta and reached Washington Thursday, May 30th. The next day I left for Richmond and arrived there Saturday night, June 1st. One feature of this 8 days' journey, which I recall very distinctly, was the comparative impressions made upon me by the camps and the preparations for war, which I saw everywhere, both at the north and in the south. They recalled Macpherson's comparison of the military strength of the two sections, and did not discredit his predictions. The camps near the principal northern towns were all of regiments. Those in the south were mostly of a company each. The arms of the northern troops were generally the long-range rifled muskets. Those of the southern troops were almost universally the old-fashioned smooth-bore muskets. The northern troops were always neatly uniformed in blue. Their camps seemed well equipped, and there was generally some visible show of military discipline about them. The Confederate uniforms were blue, grey, or brown, and sometimes uniforms were lacking. There was, too, a noticeable contrast in the physical appearance of the men, the northern and western men having more flesh and better colour. As physical machines to withstand hardships, a casual observer would have pronounced them superior to their antagonists. But I lived to see that appearances may deceive. Indeed, it became a never-ceasing wonder to the very end at Appomattox to see how our lean, ill-equipped ranks would fight, all the harder, it seemed, as the men grew thinner and more ragged and hungry-looking. Here it is, in order to speak briefly of one of the incidents leading up to the attack upon Fort Sumter, the history of which is instructive. This attack is often spoken of as the first hostile act of the war. Really, the first hostile act was the transfer of the garrison of Fort Moultrie into Fort Sumter, stealthily accomplished during the night of Dexter 26, 1860, the guns of Moultrie being spiked and their ammunition destroyed. It was a military measure which utterly changed the status quo. Both the SC authorities and President Buchanan were earnestly anxious to maintain this status, and the War Department, in its anxiety, had sent a specially detailed officer, Major Don Carlos Buell, afterward Madjont Jenon, to impress the importance of it upon Madge. Anderson in command. His instructions were to be delivered verbally, which is, surely, always a mistake in a matter of grave importance. Conversations are too often and too easily misunderstood, and exact words forgotten. In this case, it is hard to believe that Maggie Anderson could have so forgotten, not to say deliberately disobeyed, his instructions as he did, had they been given in writing. In that view of the matter, it may be said that the war was precipitated by giving important orders verbally. Another example will be found in the story of the Battle of Seven Pines, which General Joseph E. Johnston lost by trusting to instructions given verbally. Marge Buell's memorandum of the verbal instructions given is a paper of over 300 words and is a fair sample of explicit language. Here is the sentence especially referring to any change of position of the garrison of Fort Moultrie. You are to carefully avoid every act which would needlessly tend to provoke aggression, and for that reason you are not, without evident and imminent necessity, to take up any position which could be construed into the assumption of a hostile attitude. These instructions were given Deconoxy 11. The Carolina authorities were entirely satisfied with the assurances given that the status would be preserved. Both sides were, therefore, taken completely by surprise when the morning of Deccan 27 dawned and disclosed what Anderson had done. The Secretary of War telegraphed him as follows: Intelligence has reached here this morning that you have abandoned Fort Moultrie, spiked your guns, burned the carriages, and gone to Fort Sumter. It is not believed because there is no order for any such movement. Explain the meaning of this report. Anderson made in all three explanations. One had been written before being called for at 8 p.m. the night before, when his movement was barely completed. It was as follows: The step which I have taken was in my opinion necessary to prevent the effusion of blood. Next, on receipt of the telegraphic demand for explanation, he replied, I abandoned Fort Moultrie because I was certain that if attacked, my men must have been sacrificed and the command of the harbour lost. As the entire garrison numbered but 75, including officers, this was probably true. But he had instructions from the Secretary of War reading, It is neither expected nor desired that you should expose your own life or that of the men under your command in a hopeless conflict in defence of these forts. If they are invested or attacked by a force so superior that resistance would in your judgment be a useless waste of life, it will be your duty to yield to necessity and make the best terms in your power. Anderson had been selected for the command as a native of a neutral state, Kentucky, and as one who, it was hoped, would not be stampeded by imaginary danger. But his correspondence had indicated nervousness, and this had probably inspired the instructions here quoted. They evidently, however, failed of their intended effect. After sending the telegram, Madge Anderson, for the first time apparently, recalled that he had been strictly cautioned against a needless stampede and that he would be expected to show some more pressing necessity for his action. He accordingly wrote a third explanation as follows. In addition to my reasons given in my telegram and in my letter of last night, I will add as my opinion that many things convinced me that the authorities of the state designed to proceed to a hostile act. A weaker defence of such gross disobedience of orders cannot be conceived. In all the acrimony of the times, no one ever alleged the existence of any design to violate the status. President Buchanan felt himself pledged and decided to order Anderson back to Fort Moultrie and acquainted the Secretary of War Stanton with his decision. The Secretary immediately set to work to defeat this intention. He summoned Dan Sickles and planned with him to have at once salutes of 100 guns fired in New York and Philadelphia in honor of Anderson's act, and to have telegrams in hundreds showered on the President, congratulating him as a second Jackson and a savior of the country by his firmness. These demonstrations were effectively made under the joint action of Sickles and John Russell Young in Washington, of Dougherty in Philadelphia, and of Rynders in New York. They worked upon the weak side of Buchanan's character, and Anderson was allowed to remain in Fort Sumter. Buchanan excused himself to the Carolinians by saying that he would have ordered Anderson back, had they given him time before themselves taking possession of Moultrie and raising their flag over it. It was a poor excuse, but it was an occasion when any excuse would do. Passion was inflamed on both sides, and recriminations began. The position occupied by Anderson was one of unstable equilibrium, impossible to be long maintained. He had indeed saved the effusion of blood of his own command, but the act made inevitable a deluge of other blood. The crisis came in April when Fort Sumter ran short of provisions, and here the Confederate leaders lost the opportunity of their lives in not allowing provisions to be supplied, and otherwise maintaining the then status. They might thus have avoided at least the odium of firing the first gun, and gained valuable time for preparation or for possible compromises through the influence of the border states. But no compromise is ever possible after the firing of the first gun. There is in it some quality which stirs the human heart as nothing else can do. Had the British not fired upon the colonials at Lexington in 1775, we might all have been colonials yet. For blood is thicker than water, and were it not so, the development of nations would often prove painfully slow. Chapter 2. The Battle of Bull Run, July 1861. I arrived in Richmond Saturday night, June 1st, reported for duty Monday morning, and received my commission as Captain of Engineers. Engineer officers were in demand, but President Davis remembered my appearing with Madge Meyer before the Military Committee of the Senate in connection with the system of signals, and I was first ordered to start in Richmond a little factory of signal apparatus, such as torches, poles, and flags. I was told that I would soon be sent to install the system in some one of the small armies being collected at several points. I was quickly ready, and anxious for orders, which for some cause were delayed. General Robert S. Garnett was in Richmond at the time, organizing a force for service in West Virginia, and made application for me upon his staff, but it was refused. He had been commandant of the corps of cadets during my first year at West Point, and the impression I formed of him as a soldier is not lower than that formed of any other officer I have ever known. In everyone else I have seen some mere human traits, but in Garnett every trait was purely military. Had he lived, I am sure he would have been one of our great generals. He lost his life, however, in his first affair, July 13th, 1861, near Carrick's Ford Va, and in a characteristic manner. With 10 of his men, who were raw troops, he had halted to delay the enemy at a creek crossing. His men were nervous under a sharp fire, and Garnett remarked that they needed a little example. He stepped out in full view of the enemy and walked slowly back and forth, a target for the sharpshooters. He was presently shot dead, just when he was prepared to withdraw. Nearly the whole of June passed while I was kept, from day to day, awaiting orders. Near the end of June, I was ordered to organize 5 batteries of artillery into a battalion and prepare them for the field. I was forming classes for the instruction of officers and making requisitions for supplies when new orders came, sending me to signal duty with Beauregard at Manassas. I had just decided to have my wife come on to Richmond, and she was en route when I had to leave. I regretted giving up the artillery battalion. It would have been a decided step in advance had we inaugurated, so soon, a battalion organization of several batteries. We came to it about a year later, but meanwhile our batteries had been isolated and attached to infantry brigades, so they fought singly, and in such small units artillery can do little. On July 2nd I arrived at Manassas, reported to Beauregard, was assigned to duty upon his staff, and ordered to install the system of signals for use in the coming battle. It was certain that a battle must be fought soon. Federal armies were being collected in West Virginia under McClellan, on the upper Potomac threatening Winchester, under Patterson, at Alexandria under McDowell, and at Fortress Monroe under Butler. These armies were mostly raw troops, but among them were the 75,000 3-months men, first called out in April, and they were now fairly well disciplined. Their terms of service would begin to expire soon after the middle of July, and it was sure that some use would sooner be made of them. for we were then less a military nation than ever before or since, and neither side recognised its own unpreparedness. By June 24th, McDowell had submitted a plan of aggressive operation, and July 8th had been named as the date of the proposed movement. General Scott had urged longer delay, and that the 3 months' men should be allowed to go, and their places supplied with the 3 years' men now being enlisted. Political necessities, however, overruled his objections. Fortunately for the Confederates, with all their resources, the Federal forces were not able to move before the 16th, and when they did move, they consumed 4 days more, from the 17th to the 20th inclusive, in about 20 miles of marching and in preliminaries. Battle was only delivered on July 21st, and the crisis of this battle occurred about 3:30 p.m. We shall see that not only every day of that delay, but even every hour of it, was essential to the Confederate victory which resulted. So on my arrival at Manassas, July 2nd, there was really more time to install the signals than I expected, for rumours of the foe's advance now swelled upon almost every breeze. I had brought with me from Richmond all necessary equipment, and I had only to select men and train them. I soon made acquaintances and got the names of some intelligent privates who might later be promoted. I had these detailed and put upon a course of instruction and practice. Meanwhile, I procured a horse, and between times began an exploration of the country to find what facilities it offered for lines of signals. The topography was far from favourable. Our line of battle had been chosen behind the stream of Bull Run, about 3 miles north of Manassas, and the course of the stream was generally wooded and bordered with small fields and pastures, giving few open stretches. I was not sanguine of rendering any valuable service, but fortunately had time to examine the country, and, as will be seen, the line was found which disclosed the enemy's attack in time to defeat it. About a mile east of Manassas, on the farm of a Mr. Wilcoxon, was a high rocky point having a good outlook over a valley to the north and west. I made this point a central station, and by a little clearing here and there got 2 straight 6-mile ranges. One was northwest to a bluff over Bull Run Valley on our extreme left, near the house of Van Ness, just above the stone bridge by which the Warrenton Turnpike crossed Bull Run. The other was north to Centerville, about 3 miles beyond the run, opposite our centre. A third station was found near the house of McLean, opposite our right centre, and a fourth near our headquarters at Centerville. This was the utmost the topography permitted, and the men were encamped at the stations and set to practising by day and night. Where the opponents have each 2 armies in the field, each has the opportunity to combine his whole force upon his adversary. This was the situation in northern Virginia. McDowell at Alexandria with 35,000 men, and Patterson near Harper's Ferry, about 50 miles away, with 15,000, were opposed by Beauregard at Manassas with 22,000, and Johnston at Winchester with 11,000. No effort was made by the Federal Commander-in-Chief to unite Patterson's force with McDowell's, but McDowell was assured that Patterson should threaten Johnston and keep him in the valley, so that McDowell would have Beauregard only to deal with. The Confederate armies, unfortunately, had no commander-in-chief. In theory, the power resides with the President, but his action is apt to be slow and comparatively inefficient. In the approaching battle, this was well illustrated. Although the enemy was so slow as to allow amazing time, and the battle was saved, it was, as it were, by the skin of our teeth, and without any of the fruits of victory. Beauregard had proposed to the President on June 12th to take the aggressive and unite the 2 armies in an attack upon Alexandria. It was disapproved, but Beauregard did not let the matter drop. On July 13th, he sent Colonel Chestnut, a staff officer, to Richmond to urge the concentration of the 2 armies and a prompt offensive movement. A formal hearing was had by the President with Cooper and Lee, but the proposition was rejected on the good ground that the enemy was as yet practically within his fortified lines, where he could not be attacked, and could bring up, at his leisure, Patterson and other reinforcements. The only effective way to combine the 2 armies was to make it a surprise to the enemy when away from his fortifications. About noon, July 16th, McDowell put his army in motion. there were 10 brigades in 4 divisions, comprising about 30,000 men with 49 guns. He did not bring his whole force, but left in reserve, in the works behind him, Runyon's division of over 5,000 men. This large division would have been of greater value on the field, and he should have had at least 100 guns, for artillery is the best arm against raw troops. The 4 divisions moved by different roads, converging toward our advanced positions about Fairfax. They made on the first day only short marches of 6 or 8 miles, going into camp far outside of our picket lines, so as not to divulge the movement. This was so well managed that, although rumours reached the Confederates, yet nothing was known until next morning. Then our advanced posts were driven in, and a few of our pickets were captured. At this moment, Johnston's army should have been ready to march to Beauregard over roads previously selected and reconnoitred. The men should even have been kept for days encamped where they could quickly stretch out on the proper roads. For many contingencies beset all marches, and preparation saves hours big with fate. The whole day of the 17th was lost to the Confederates by the news having to go to the President. Beauregard, sometime during the day, telegraphed him as follows: Manassas, July 17, 1861. The enemy has assailed my outposts in heavy force. I have fallen back on the line of Bull Run and will make a stand at Mitchell's Ford. If his force is overwhelming, I shall retire to the Rappahannock Railroad Bridge, saving my command for defence there and for future operations. Please inform Johnston of this, via Staunton, and also Holmes. Send forward any reinforcements at the earliest possible moment, and by every possible means. G. T. Beauregard. Apparently, after some deliberation, the executive acted, for about 1 a.m. on July 18th, Johnston in Winchester received a telegram. It is worthy of study as a model not to be followed in such cases. It was as follows: Richmond, July 17th, 1861. General Beauregard is attacked. To strike the enemy a decisive blow, all of your effective force will be needed. If practicable, make the movement, sending your sick and baggage to Culpeper C.H., either by railroad or by Warrenton. In all the arrangements, exercise your discretion. S. Cooper, Adjut, and Insa's General. When Johnston came to make his report of the Battle of Bull Run, he wrote as follows of this message: About 1 o'clock in the morning of July 18th, I received from the government a telegraphic despatch informing me that the Northern Army was advancing upon Manassas, then held by General Beauregard, and directing me, if practicable, to go to that officer's assistance, after sending my sick to Culpeper C.H. In the exercise of discretion conferred by the terms of the order, I at once determined to march to join General Beauregard. President Davis took great offence at this language and ordered the word after before the words sending your sick to be erased from the report in the records. He resented also Beauregard's speaking of this order in his report as only permissive and not mandatory. And even in his book, written after the war, he claims that the order was a positive one and considers it strange that anyone has construed it otherwise. The words, if practicable, are always of such doubtful interpretation that they should be excluded from all important orders. They leave matters in doubt. Every order should be distinctly either the one thing or the other. Lee used the phrase at Gettysburg, in ordering Ewell to press a routed enemy, and lost his victory by it. It is notable, too, that this order not only failed to urge haste, but, by injunctions concerning sick and baggage by rail, implied that time would permit, which it did not. Exclusive use of the railroad by the troops was absolutely necessary. Had Johnston felt any reluctance to the movement, or had Patterson's attitude been in the least threatening, excuses would have been easy to make for non-compliance. But Johnston was a good soldier, and he lost no time in taking the road. He quickly arranged for the best route of march and for the indispensable help of the railroad in moving his infantry. His leading brigade was under command of Jackson, soon to show the world the stuff of which he was formed, and to earn an immortal name. Jackson's brigade left camp at noon, and at 10 o'clock that night bivouacked at Paris, 17 miles, fording the Shenandoah and crossing the Blue Ridge en route. This is an average of about 1¾ miles an hour and is an excellent march under the circumstances. The other 3 brigades, B's, Bartow's and Elsie's, made about 13 miles and encamped at the Shenandoah, itself a good march. Next morning, Friday the 19th, Jackson's brigade covered the remaining 6 miles from Paris to the railroad station at Piedmont, 34 miles from Manassas, by 8 a.m. Trains were awaiting it, and by 10 a.m. it was off, arriving at Manassas about 1 p.m., say 2,500 strong, and coming 57 miles in 25 hours. The other brigades arrived at Piedmont during the afternoon, but although the railroad had promised to deliver all 4 brigades in Manassas by sunrise Saturday, the 20th, only 2 more regiments, the 7th and 8th Garci of Bartow's brigade, about 1,400 men, were sent. The cavalry and artillery continued their march by the wagon road, but the infantry waited at Piedmont, some of it for 2 days, and without rations. The trouble was that the railroad had no relays of employees and was unable to hold its men at constant work. On the 20th, Johnston himself went with the 4th Ala, the 2nd Miss, and 2 companies of the 11th Miss, about 1,000 men. These were the last troops to arrive in time for the opening of the battle. During the night, the 6th NC, 10th VAR, 3D10, and 1st MAMD were taken, about 2,000 men, under Kirby Smith and Elzey. These, arriving at Manassas before noon on Sunday, were hurried to the battlefield, 6 miles, arrived at the critical moment at the critical point, and changed defeat into victory. The remaining 2,500 of Johnston's 11,000, the 9th Guermet, 2nd Tenney, 13th Vey, the Kai Battalion, and 8 companies of the 11th Miss, only arrived the day after the battle, having been nearly 4 days making the 57 miles. On the 19th, while Johnston was waiting at Piedmont, one of Beauregard's staff arrived to suggest that Johnston should march by Aldie and fall upon McDowell's flank at Centerville, while Beauregard attacked from Bull Run. It was an unwise scheme, and Johnston's decision to unite the 2 armies out of the presence of the enemy was safest. Meanwhile, by monumental mismanagement, Patterson's army might as well have been upon another planet. He had been notified that McDowell would advance on the 16th, and that he must hold and occupy Johnston. Accordingly, on the 15th he advanced from Martinsburg to Bunker Hill. He remained all day on the 16th at Bunker Hill, and on the 17th moved as far as Charlestown in the direction of Harper's Ferry. Here he remained until after the battle on the 21st. On the 18th he telegraphed, "The enemy has stolen no march on me. I have kept him actively employed, and by threats and reconnaissances in force caused him to be reinforced. I have accomplished in this respect more than the General-in-Chief asked, or could well be expected in face of an enemy far superior in numbers." Only on the 20th did he find out that something had happened, and he reports, "With a portion of his force, Johnston left Winchester by the road to Millwood on the afternoon of the 18th. His whole force was about 35,200. These telegrams are fair specimens of the colossal misinformation often conveyed in official reports. Johnston, in his narrative, humorously suggests that the overrating of each other's strength by opposing commanders resulted probably from the same feeling which made his antagonist's sword seem to Gil Blas d'une longueur excessive. If Johnston's sword had been as long as Patterson believed, it would have been creditable in the latter to approach even within 14 miles. And now, at sunrise on the 17th, McDowell is in front of our pickets at Fairfax, and within 10 miles of our line of battle, and he is to have us at the mercy of his superior force until the afternoon of the 21st, say 4 days and a half. If the shades of departed warriors watched the contest, the odds among them against us at this stage must have been high. Against their force, our position and our organisation were both inferior. Our line of battle was nearly 7 miles long, and communications in rear of it were poor and crooked. Our 6 brigades were all independent of each other. no divisions having been formed, and there were, besides, several unbrigaded regiments and batteries, making a command too complex to be efficiently handled, especially with an inexperienced staff. Apart from their superior numbers, the effective division organisation of the Federals, and especially their batteries of regular artillery with each division, would seem enough to ensure Federal victory even for a front attack by brute force. This might have been made, even on the afternoon of the 17th, by a bold pursuit of our advanced guard, which comprised but one brigade. For the slowness of the Federal advance that day, it holds the record for slowness, McDowell was personally responsible. He had issued to his troops a good order of march, in which he called attention to the strength of each column, and its ability to cope with all it was likely to meet, even without the help of the other columns. But he had spoiled the moral effect of his own language, and practically demoralized his brigade commanders by one unwise caution. It would not be pardonable in any commander to come upon a battery or breastwork without a knowledge of its position. That caution meant more to McDowell's officers than appears on its face. For the newspaper reporters of those days, with the appetite for sensations which still distinguishes the era, had made a great bugbear of masked batteries. The term originated at the attack upon Fort Sumter, where a certain battery was constructed, masked by a house which was destroyed just before opening fire. After that, masked batteries figured on every field and in every event. When Butler was repulsed at Big Bethel, it was a masked battery which did it. When Schenk's railroad reconnaissance from Alexandria on June 17th accidentally ran into Gregg's reconnaissance from Manassas at Vienna and was fired into by Kemper's 6-pounders, the mysterious masked battery got the credit. Soon, to read the newspapers, one might believe the woods were infested with such batteries, not to mention Louisiana Tigers and Black Horse Cavalry, two other scarecrow names which had caught the reporters' fancies and been made to do enormous duty. Now, the threat conveyed in McDowell's order implied the real existence of formidable dangers, and is doubtless responsible for the excessive caution which consumed the day in making an advance scarcely over 5 miles. Beauregard's advanced guard had not sought to delay the Federals, but had fallen back beyond Centreville, where it bivouacked, and early next morning it crossed Bull Run and took position in the Confederate line of battle. Beauregard had concentrated the bulk of his force between Union Mills Ford on the right and Mitchell's Ford on the left, in which space, about 3 miles, he had, in order from the right, Ewell's, D.R. Jones's, Longstreet's and Bonham's brigades, with only Early in reserve some 250 yards behind. Longstreet. Cox's brigade held Bull's Ford, and Evans with the 4th SC and Wheat's La. Battalion held the Stone Bridge, 2 and 3 miles to the left. On the morning of the 18th, the slow advance of the Federals was resumed, and about noon Tyler's division occupied the hills overlooking the valley of Bull Run, opposite Blackburn's and Mitchell's Fords. McDowell was not with his advanced forces. He had ridden far to the left to reconnoitre, with a view to turning our right flank, a duty he might have more wisely confided to his staff. During his absence, a small affair occurred at Blackburn's Ford, terminating favourably for the Confederates. Tyler's instructions were to reconnoitre our position and to threaten our left so as to draw attention to that quarter, but not to bring on a general engagement. These instructions were our salvation, for our army was weak and badly posted, and could not have withstood a vigorous attack by the force in front of us. Both of our flanks were in the air, and Bull Run could be crossed by infantry in many places. Our centre was a large salient whose lines the enemy could enfilade. The ground on their side was commanding and afforded close approach under excellent cover. On our side it was low and gently rising to the rear, giving no cover whatever except of the woods. Our whole force present on the field was about 21,000, of whom about 5,000, Evans's and Cox's commands, were too far to the left to be available. McDowell's force available was about 37,000. Tyler, about noon, brought up some guns and began firing at the few points in our territory where he could discern signs of our presence. After cannonading for some time without drawing reply, Tyler ordered Richardson's brigade to scour the woods in front, and a squadron of cavalry with 2 guns to advance on the road to Mitchell's Ford. 2 of our guns under Kemper fired upon the cavalry when it came into view. It was quickly withdrawn, and Tyler soon decided to withdraw Richardson also. Meanwhile, this brigade had suddenly become engaged. It had found itself on a low bluff overlooking Bull Run, scarcely 50 yards away, a thin fringe of woods intervening. Just across the creek was Longstreet's brigade, about 1,400 strong, occupying the low opposite bank of the stream. Immediately both sides opened fire, and a portion of Longstreet's men, finding themselves in the lower position and on open ground, broke to the rear badly. Longstreet rode among and rallied them, and soon led them back, the enemy's line having also withdrawn under cover. Longstreet called upon Early for reinforcement, and the 7th Lahr was sent forward to him. Meanwhile, the Federals made a second advance and poured in another volley and fell back. These tactics were repeated several times, Longstreet meanwhile attempting to cross some of his men over the ford to meet the enemy. The 7th Lahr, however, on one of the Federal advances, had opened fire while still behind Longstreet's line. This fire in the rear threw Longstreet into such confusion that the order to cross was recalled. Our line was in bad shape when the Federal attack ceased, and their force was rapidly withdrawn. 2 companies, however, under Captain Murray, had crossed the stream, and these pursued the enemy's retreat for some distance and brought back some 20 prisoners and 100 muskets. This gave an air of victory to the termination of the infantry combat. There then followed a sharp artillery duel for about 45 minutes. The Federals engaged 8 guns, 2 20 PR and 2 10 PR Parrott rifles, 2 6 PR guns and 2 12 PR howitzers, and fired 415 rounds. The Confederates engaged 7 guns, 4 6 PR guns, and 3 3-inch iron rifles, made in Richmond, firing a 6 PR Burton and Archer projectile. They fired 310 rounds. Our guns stood in the open plateau about 150 yards behind our infantry line, and were hidden from the enemy's view by the thin fringe of tall timber along the creek. This saved us from a speedy defeat, for our limbers and caissons were without cover until Longstreet ordered them brought forward on the flanks and kept them behind the trees. Thus neither of the combatants could see more of the other than the smoke of his guns, and the fire was but little better than random. Our guns belonged to the Washington Artillery of New Orleans, the oldest and best drilled organization of artillery in the Confederacy. It illustrates the lack of professional skill among our volunteers to know that a favorable report was made upon the Burton and Archer projectile from its performance in this affair, where it was used for the first time. Yet the first competent test made of it a few weeks later showed it to be entirely worthless and caused its manufacture to be at once discontinued. It would not fly point foremost, but tumbled and had no range. Besides these 3 rifles with ineffective ammunition, a 4th Confederate gun, a brass 6-pounder, soon became useless from an enlarged vent. During the first half of the affair, however, the enemy's fire was not accurate and all went well. There was then a pause, during which they managed to improve their aim, and when they resumed, our men soon realized how they were overmatched. Capt. Eschliman was wounded, and Capt. Squires called for reinforcement. Longstreet had no more artillery available and ordered Squires to withdraw gradually, 1 gun at a time, but meanwhile to keep up a slow reply. Just then, as so often happens when a battle is becoming desperate, the enemy ceased to fire and allowed Squires, who deserved it, the honour of the last shot, and Beauregard the invaluable morale of the first victory. In this duel, the Confederates had 1 killed, 5 wounded, and 6 horses disabled. The Federals had 2 killed and 2 wounded. In the whole affair, the losses were... On the night of the 18th, McDowell found himself compelled to make a change in the plan of attack which had been decided on in Washington before starting. That had contemplated the turning of our right flank. But his reconnaissance in that direction had found the country so wooded and broken, and with so few good roads, as to be unfavourable for operations. His next thought was a direct attack upon our front. That was, beyond question, his best opportunity. We had practically no entrenchment, and there were gaps, sometimes wide ones, between our brigades. Holmes's brigade of 2 regiments, the 2D10 and 9th Arc, coming from Aquia Creek, did not arrive until late on the 19th. The confusion caused in our ranks by Tyler's demonstration, for it can scarcely be called an attack, indicates that a serious effort with the whole force at hand would have succeeded. McDowell had disapproved of Tyler's affair upon his return from his reconnaissance and seems to have misunderstood the facts. In his official report, he writes that this affair had shown us to be too strong to be attacked at Blackburn's Ford. He also states that the stone bridge was mined and defended by a battery and a heavy abattis, and that his only alternative was to seek a route to turn our left flank. No one of these statements was correct. At Stone Bridge, there was neither abattis, earthwork, nor mine. There were only 2 6-pounder guns with the 4th SC Regiment and Wheat's LA Battalion, say 1,400 men. There were no other supports within a mile. The movement decided upon, however, promised excellent results if it could be carried out before Beauregard was reinforced. It was decided to turn the Confederate left by crossing Bull Run above the Stone Bridge. This involved further loss of time in reconnaissance, but confidence was felt that Patterson would keep Johnston in the valley, so the engineers were ordered to find the desired roads. It was not dreamed that Johnston's forces were crossing the Blue Ridge as the sun was setting that afternoon. McDowell proposed to make his reconnaissance by main force, driving in our pickets and developing our exact position and strength, but he weakly allowed himself to be persuaded, instead, into a reconnaissance by stealth, which is less to be depended upon. It is worthy of note that upon 3 occasions in this advance, McDowell was persuaded by his leading subordinates to modify orders which he had issued, and these modifications lost him the battle. The first occasion was on the 17th, when his army only marched some 5 or 6 miles, as already noted. McDowell wished to have the march prolonged to 12 miles, but yielded to persuasion to go into bivouac when half the distance was covered. That practically lost the entire day. The second occasion was the reconnaissance by stealth to which he now consented. It occupied a day and a half and went miles astray, as may now be seen, in finding the shortest route. It was noon on the 20th when the engineers made their report of having found a concealed road crossing Bull Run at Sudley Ford, and the march was decided upon. From their present camps, the average distances to be covered by the turning brigades were between 9 and 10 miles. McDowell proposed that they should make 4 miles that afternoon, leaving only 6 for the next morning. For the third time his officers proposed, and McDowell consented to, a change. It would be more convenient, they urged, to remain in their camps that afternoon and night, and to march a couple of hours earlier in the morning, say at 2:30 a.m. Orders were issued accordingly for the 21st. When they came to be executed, the routes of various commands were found to interfere, and although there was a bright moon and the country was open and roads good, the head of the column was about 4 hours in covering the first 4 miles. This involved a further loss of at least 2 hours. It is now time to revert to the Confederate lines and note what had happened on the 19th and 20th. An attack in force by the Federals had been expected each morning, and its non-occurrence gratefully appreciated. It might be supposed that our time would have been busily used to entrench, erect batteries, and provide abattis and obstructions, but almost nothing of the sort was done. It required a year's experience to educate our army to the value of such work, although the enemy, meanwhile, not only set us many examples, but had given us some severe object lessons. On the 19th, Holmes's brigade had arrived from Aquia Creek. It took position behind Ewell, on our right flank. Jackson's brigade also arrived and was placed in reserve behind Mitchell's Ford. On the 20th, Johnston arrived in person, also the 7th and 8th Gay, of Bartow's brigade, the 4th Ayler, and the 2d Miss of B's. These troops were placed in reserve behind Blackburn's Ford. As already told, these were the only troops of Johnston's army to arrive in time for the beginning of the battle. though another brigade under Kirby Smith arrived in time to turn the wavering scale about 3 p.m. on the 21st. It is strange that all this could go on in such close proximity to the Federal Army without discovery through some Negro or deserter. It is still stranger that McDowell seems to have had no scouts out, upon either flank, who might easily have learned it. Only one intimation reached him of what was going on, and that he refused to credit. General Tyler was an experienced railroad manager, and from the hills north of Bull Run on the 19th, he had listened to the exhaust of many engines bringing heavy loads into Manassas from the direction of the valley. He correctly guessed that they were bringing Johnston's army, and reported the facts and his conclusions to McDowell, not only on the 19th, but again on the 20th. The suggestions were received very coolly, and no steps were taken to find out. From Centerville, the Warrenton Pike runs straight southwest for many miles. At 2 miles, it crosses Cub Run, a tributary of Bull Run, on a high wooden bridge. In the retreat, this bridge became blocked, and many guns were lost there. At 4 miles, it crosses Bull Run on Stone Bridge. A little beyond Cub Run, a farm road to the right, by a circuitous route of 6 miles, leads to Sudley Springs ford of Bull Run, which is 2 miles above Stone Bridge in an airline. From Sudley, on the south side of Bull Run, a road to the southeast crosses the Warrenton Pike a mile beyond Stone Bridge and leads to Manassas. McDowell's plan was as follows. Tyler with 3 brigades was to take position opposite the Stone Bridge, make demonstrations, and be prepared to cross. McDowell in person would conduct the 5 brigades of Hunter's and Heintzelman's divisions by the circuitous road, cross Bull Run at Sudley Ford, and attack Stone Bridge in the rear. As soon as it was carried, Tyler's 3 brigades would cross, and the 8 brigades, united behind our left flank, could easily sweep our entire line. There was, however, one bad feature. The circuitous route by which the 5 brigades would march would take them dangerously far from his other forces, should Beauregard take the offensive and attack his left at the moment when this turning column was entangled in the circuitous road. The fear of such an attack induced McDowell, while actually on the march, to halt his rear brigade, Howard's, and leave it behind until the 4 other brigades had crossed Bull Run and were in action on the south side. That brigade was thus out of use for 4 critical hours, and when it rejoined, the battle had been lost. Its only service was in covering the retreat. Meanwhile, by a coincidence, Beauregard had planned to make the very attack which McDowell had feared, and at the very time when he was stretched out on the circuitous road. As Johnston was Beauregard's senior, he was now in command of the joint forces, but as Beauregard was more familiar with the situation, it was left to him to decide upon the order of battle. By uniting the 2 armies, the Confederates had prepared a surprise for the Federals, but to reap the full benefit, it should be sprung upon them before they became aware of their danger. Beauregard's order of battle proposed to cross Bull Run with our 3 right brigades, envelop the enemy's exposed left flank and drive it toward Centerville. As soon as this battle was joined, it would be taken up to the left by adjoining brigades in succession. We now had 8 brigades concentrated on a front of about 3 miles, and, opposed to them, McDowell had left but 3 brigades. We could never hope for a more favourable opportunity to quickly crush these 3 brigades and be prepared to meet in detail those which McDowell would have to bring back from his right. Unfortunately, however, we failed to improve the opportunity, and it vanished. The history of our failure is as follows. Had Beauregard been in command, the so-called orders issued would have been immediate and would have been put into the process of execution at dawn. But, presumably by Johnston's wish, they were merely instructions to each brigade to place itself in a position of attack upon the enemy and await orders. The orders to attack would be given by the Commander-in-Chief. These instructions were sent out at 5 a.m. and were differently understood by the officers addressed. Ewell, with Holmes, did not advance across Bull Run, but simply held himself in readiness on the south side. Jones and Longstreet crossed their brigades and took position on the north bank. Bonham's brigade did not move. Johnston had expected the arrival during the night of his troops still in the rear. When he found that they had not arrived, he determined not to attack, but to await developments. He consented, however, to a demonstration by Beauregard's right, and orders were sent to Ewell and Jones to advance. The order to Ewell was lost. It never reached him and was never found or accounted for afterward. Jones crossed and waited for 2 hours before the situation was developed. It was then thought too late, and he was withdrawn. About 6 a.m., Tyler's division appeared before our force under Evans at Stone Bridge and presently opened a slow fire with a 30-pounder Parrott rifle. The movement of Tyler toward Stone Bridge early in the morning had been discovered by Longstreet's scouts. He writes of it in his book, page 45. Their report was sent promptly to headquarters, and after a short delay, the brigade Longstreet's was ordered back to its position behind the run.